Alright, so welcome to this week on the Learning Hub blog. The writing series that we're doing for this month is Commonly Confused Words, and since we are at the end of April, we are going to be wrapping up here with a discussion of a number of us writing tutors who see a lot of these commonly confused words frequently in student writing. I am Alec Bartz. I am a professional tutor up here at the Hub.
I'm Brock.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Damon.
So I think the first thing that we were going to start talking about is whether or not this actually is a problem. Is commonly confused words an actual problem in student writing? And I think that the first kind of opinion that I have is it is, but it also isn't. So I know it's kind of a cop-out, but in the sense that it is in the fact that you want to be clear and concise, I think, with your writing. That's the most important thing, especially for students doing research. Or students writing a paper for a class. I think it's very important that you're clear with your writing. But also in the sense of if that commonly confused word, if you're mistyping something or if you're miswriting something, but it doesn't get in the way of the meaning of what you're saying, then I don't really think it's necessarily as big of a problem. I think if your audience understands the intention of the original writing, that it doesn't really have to be something that is this existential problem that I think sometimes we can make it out to be, especially when we see it in writing.
Well, I guess that really brings up the issue of sometimes students don't recognize that this is a word that they are confusing. Because if it's a commonly confused word, it is that for a reason. It's being confused on a regular basis. And I guess part of the issue is that the people who determine its use are not always within that student's usual idea of what the audience is. So it's a term that they are maybe confusing with another, or misspelling, or misusing in some way. I think one of the things that I recognize often, and I don't know if I have a particular example for this, but they are words that simply sound like another word, and they're using the wrong one. I mean, there's the typical example of the there, and there. But I also just see other words that I can imagine the students saying, and they think it's that word, but I'm recognizing that, like you say, I'm recognizing that they mean a different word, and they have not written that in their paper. And, you know, for them, I think it comes down to a little bit of a process issue. That the draft that I saw was earlier. It may have been written in a single sitting, and they haven't had the opportunity to go back with their revision. They may catch it in the revision, but they haven't yet. So I think it's just important to recognize that this may be a commonly confused word in your first draft, but as you go through successive drafts, maybe do one in which you look particularly at your word choices, and particularly for the more complex, maybe discipline-specific words, make sure you're choosing the correct one.
I guess for me, like, in terms of like reading students' drafts, I don't really pay that much attention to it, kind of like what you say, like the meaning's there, you understand what the meaning is. But then when you kind of like look more intently on like those kind of minor aspects, depending on which kind of words you're confusing or not getting right, that could really like impact the message that you're trying to send, but then also like just really affect like your credibility as a writer too. And so I think obviously the message and the meaning I think is the most important, but I think all those little more minor parts, especially of language, I guess really add up to your overall credibility and a reader's perception of you as a writer too. So I think that's.
And I think that's a great point, especially whenever you think about multiple commonly confused words in the same paper. You know, that if you're doing this over and over and over again in the same paper, then that really sends a clear message to your audience that you haven't really done your due diligence to check this out.
I think, kind of going back to what you two were saying, in a sense, there's always that main argument that you can still take away from a paper even if there are these confused words in it. But on a more, on a smaller level, it can distract the reader. So if they are confusing, they're there and there. Sometimes, like when I'm reading a confused word like that, I stop as a reader and think, that's not right. Like either they didn't recognize it or they don't know. And I stop and think about it for, 5 seconds and then go back into the paper. And I think that distraction alters the experience as a reader. So while it's not the biggest issue, it is something that alters the perception of the reader.
And I think it's really important to recognize that words do evolve over time. I recently wrote about insure and ensure, the difference with an I and the difference between an E. And I went to the Oxford English Dictionary to get a sense of the history. And they have changed a lot over time. It's only more recently that we've started making the distinction that insure with an I has more to do with purchasing something. But that was not an original distinction that they made between these two words. And it could change again. So I think it's important to recognize that some of this is just keeping up with, well, how is this word used now? What's the proper form of this word now? And if it has a specific meaning within the discourse community that I am speaking to. I originally encountered the difference between the two insurers, in particular when working with legal writing. And they are very particular about whether you use insure with an I or insure with an E. It's a very important legal distinction. So they are very intent in it on a way that in other areas they might not be so intent on, because there is a lot of overlap between the meanings of those words. So I think it's important to recognize that these things change, and they can also change depending on what community you're speaking to.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think one of the places we see that the most is not necessarily, especially nowadays, is not necessarily in commonly confused words, but when we talk about words that are changing their meaning in usage, when we talk about they as a singular pronoun. That's something that people push up against a lot, especially more formal grammarians who are like, no, this is a very specific plural usage when you're talking about they, you're talking about more than one person. But every day when in conversation, I'm going to tell somebody, oh yeah, I saw them at the store. I could literally just be talking about a single person. And that's the way that we speak colloquially, and that's the way that the language has evolved. So. Okay, so now I think we can all kind of go through and talk about which ones bother us the most. We can have a conversation about whether or not this is a major problem in writing, but I think we all have our own pet peeves or things that we see in writing that kind of make us do a double take. And I'd say for me, that one is the one that you mentioned. It's kind of the most common one that we see. It's there, there, and there. And the reason for that is mainly, I think, what Michael was talking about. It's because it shows me that you haven't done your due diligence in thinking about what are the distinctions between these two words. You haven't thought too much about that word usage. Because oftentimes I'll understand and I'll know which word you're intending to use or which word is supposed to be there. And so it's not really confusing, it's just more of how much time have you taken in constructing this piece of writing. And if those are confused words, then that tells me that not that you haven't spent any time, but that maybe you haven't done your due diligence in that.
I'm gonna jump on that because that's one of my biggest ones. But then and then also is, for those reasons, but also because for me reading a student's paper, like a college level student's paper, and obviously it differs whether you're a native speaker or a non-native speaker, but I think those two specifically are ones that at least I learned when I was kind of like grade school age, and so I kind of like am curious as to what like the trip up is for a lot of native speakers that we have as students who are 18, 19 plus, and what really trips them up, because if those are words that you learn at a young age, those are kind of basic spelling words when you're in first grade, second grade. And if you're still kind of misinterpreting the meaning, is there something else at play that we aren't covering and learning the difference between those? And that differs, I think, from words like illusion and illusion, and more words that are kind of tied to like there's very specific kind of. You're not going to probably use the word illusion like every day in a sentence usually. So with words like that, I can see the trip up because it has a clear definition and it might not be a word that you use very much. But with there, and there, and then, those are words that are kind of daily conversations. So yeah, just kind of more basic ones like that get me thinking.
I think for me, it's it's in the contracted form of it is. I just noticed that immediately. Usually it's a case of trying to make it's a possessive form, but it's already is the possessive form. It's not the contracted form of it is. And it's because you mentioned these mistakes slowing down your reading process and distracting from the meaning. I tend to read it as it is if I see the contracted form, and it totally messes up the sentence if you do that and they meant it's. So that's the one that gets to me. I understand oftentimes why the mistake is being made, and frankly, I know I've made it before. I just try to catch it on successive proofreads.
Well, with some of these words too, that just reminded me of this. Sometimes Microsoft Word will tell you, if that's the platform that you're using to construct your writing, it will tell you oftentimes the incorrect option, right? So it'll underline your it's with an apostrophe s and tell you that it should be it's with no apostrophe. And you're like, no, I meant that it's supposed to have an apostrophe. And I don't think students oftentimes look and think critically about Microsoft Word because Microsoft Word has that credibility, right? They have their algorithm and they think, oh, well, what do I know more than Microsoft Word? And I think that it's worth remembering oftentimes as students, as scholars, that you do have knowledge that you brought with you, and that you can know more than a computer, right, in many times, because the computer can't measure context. It can't measure the sentence that you're using it within, and so oftentimes the algorithm can misrepresent something. So to that point too, it's very important to know. It's in there.
Brock, you're not annoyed by anything?
You're the only one.
I don't think that I have necessarily a pet peeve of confused words. More so that, as a reader, I recognize especially the different forms of there and it's, but I wouldn't really necessarily say that I'm frustrated or annoyed when I see those being confused in writing. More so that I just quickly recognize that it was a mistake, whether it's something that they knew or didn't know, and kind of move on. But beyond those two, I don't think there's very many confused words that really get me going.
Okay. So now that we've kind of talked about what our pet peeves are, with the exception of the one that's not judging anybody, it's fine. We can kind of talk about if we know of any, or if we know of any specific to our pet peeve approaches to avoiding the incorrect usage. So I know with there, and there, the one that I did not use in my own personal writing, because I honestly can't remember the approach that I used to remember there, and there. But I wrote the blog post on there, and there, and I looked up a couple different approaches that people had used in order to remember the differences. And what they said was look within the word. And I found that very interesting, and I didn't really know what it meant until I kept digging into it. The word there, T-H-E-R-E, has the word here within it. And so it tells you that you're talking about location. So when you use there, you're talking about location, T-H-E-R-E. If you're talking about there as in T-H-E-I-R, then you're talking about the word that's within that is air. And so you're talking about inheritance, so you're talking about a person. and then that means that there is of or belonging to somebody else. And there, as in THEY apostrophe RE, is a contraction, which of course we know means that you're adding two words. So that apostrophe there tells you that you've got two words together. So they and are, and you can tell the difference between those two. So I found that kind of interesting. It's not one that I've personally used, but it's one that I felt like could be the most effective when you're writing down that word. And you can kind of look within the word that you've written down and say, you know, is that appropriate for this context? Am I talking about here the location or not? And if you aren't, then you know it's one of the other options, and you can just use process of elimination to get to the right one.
Yeah, with the it's and it is fairly easy to recognize which one you want by just, if you want it is, say it completely, it is, and see if it still makes sense. Thankfully, in a lot of academic writing, we avoid contractions completely, so it probably shouldn't be used at all. So if you have an it's in there, it should actually be referring to the possessive and not it is.
Yeah, I guess for then and man, I mean, I don't really have like, I guess, any easy way to do it like that, but I think of it as, okay, then if you're talking about something happening, it has the E, which I always think of stands for event. So it's like this happened, then this happened, this next event happened. So I think of it in terms of that.
And Brock wasn't really
Yeah, so
Well, I'm gonna go a different path than you guys again. And I guess my argument is why remember the way certain words are supposed to be. I know, like, I just wrote about capital and capital, the difference between those, and to be 100% honest, I didn't know the difference until I wrote the post. And it is something that has always been in the back of my mind. I didn't know which was which. And I wasn't necessarily bugged by that, and then I looked it up and learned the difference, found it very interesting, and if I forget that in 6 months, that's fine with me. Because I know I can always go back and just Google it. There are so many different resources out there, and all you have to do is put them into that search bar and remind yourself real quick. And I know, in the middle of writing, that can be a little bit of a distraction from, writing down your thoughts, but taking that 10 extra seconds to go and find the differences between the words can make a big difference in the perception of your writing.
okay, so I think that's everything that we have as far as our discussion on the month of April's topic, which is commonly confused words. I think that it's been fruitful, but I think ultimately what you'll want to remember is much along the lines of what Brock says. I think that you're not expected as students, none of us are expected as students or writers to always know the difference between every word. And that it's not about memorizing these rules or memorizing these different approaches, but just knowing that these distinctions are important and taking the time while you're writing, if you do run into something that you are unsure of or that you think might be commonly confused, that you're taking the time to seek out the answers to those, and that you are accurately, I suppose, representing your writing and yourself in all of the projects and assignments that you do.